Termo to Madeline, audio edition. Page 16. Matt Haley, an Irishman at Tule Lake. Matthew Haley was a tall, raw-boned, red-headed Irishman, another character that fit into the life of the Madeline Plains like a hand in a glove. Like Theodore Winters, he was wealthy, but he had earned every cent he had through hard work and shrewd business. At one time or another, about every rancher in Lassen, Modoc counties, and some in Plumas counties, owed him money. When he could not collect the foreclosure on the property, and thus became a large landowner. But he had come to this country a barefoot boy of 17 in 1844. Matt Haley was born in Cavan County, Ireland, in 1827. He grew up in that very location, but as he got older, like many other boys at that age, he could not get along with his father. So he worked his way to the United States on a sea freighter. He landed on the East Coast, but soon came out west where all the opportunity seemed to be. His tracks go all over the state of California, from Los Angeles to San Francisco, and on up well into the state of Oregon. He dealt in a variety of businesses, but eventually settled mainly on livestock raising. On September 24th, 1874, he bought 160 acres of land from Frank Thomas on the east end of what was known at the time as Tule Marsh on Cedar Creek. Cedar Creek was probably the best year-round stream in the country, draining all the high country around Clark's Valley. Normally, however, it did not flow into the Tule Marsh. Only in the spring of the year, when the water was high and in flood stage, did it run over the banks and make a lake in the marsh, which was only slightly lower in elevation than the creek itself. Frank Thomas had changed the course of Cedar Creek in late summer of 1873, however. He put in almost a mile of ditch with a team and scraper and ran all the water from the creek into the Tule Marsh, thus creating Tule Lake. Matt Haley was a very innovative Irishman and began expanding on this idea as soon as he got the place. He lengthened the ditch and made it deeper and wider to carry all the water of Cedar Creek, even in the high runoff periods of the spring. Then he dug another ditch on the lower north side of the marsh and brought the excess water back around the hillside and dumped it back into its original channel about an eighth of a mile from the upper ditch. With this work completed, he beat it down to the country seat in Susanville and filed on the whole thing as swamp and overflow. Some 1,600 acres of it, and while he was at it, he filed on another 320 acres of swamp and overflow property up the canyon about half a mile to Clark's Valley. Many stories are told about old-timers who put a boat in a wagon and their team of horses pulled them around the piece of land they wanted as they rode furiously to meet the government's requirements for swamp land. Actually, Uncle Sam was very lax with that requirement, and a lot of land that had little or no swamp characteristics was taken up under that act. This was not the case with Matt Haley's Tule Lake property. He had a real swamp, which he had helped to create, and he had already built a drainage system for it, another government requirement. Haley did not get the patent on this land until 1886. But in the meantime, he set about making it into a show place. He built a house and barns and corrals on the west end of the marsh. With this drainage system, he had enough good irrigated ground to supply hay for all of his stock, and he had plenty of livestock, several hundreds of both cattle and horses. Even with all those animals, his place raised enough hay that in the next 10 or 15 years he began selling hay to his neighbors as they needed it. As the years went along, Matt Haley acquired more land and ranches around the Madeline Plains and in South Fork Valley, but none would compare to his Tule Lake Ranch, which at its peak customarily ran 1,700 head of cattle and 400 horses. George H. Bailey, a gentleman and a pioneer. George H. Bailey never kept a permanent residence on the Madeline Plains, but of all the outsiders who used the area as a summer range, he was one of very, very few who put back as much as he took away from it. George Bailey was a builder, an organizer, a great motivator and leader. And that was something that the Plains seldom saw in those years, especially among large operators. A progressive and conscientious businessman he was, but a coyote, a cutthroat, shrewd, he was not. In short, he was a very refined gentleman, respectful of his neighbors and respected by all. George Bailey did, of course, fall into some of the categories that were common to the pioneer stockmen of the Plains. One very prominent characteristic he had was being very typical a single man. But, unlike men such as Daniel MacDonald, he did not die a violent death at an early age. More on the order of Matt Haley, he lived in a ripe old age, dying in 1916 at the age of 79. Like so many of the early pioneers to California, he came west in 1848 at the age of 11 from Mississippi. For over 20 years he lived and built up a cattle business in the Bay Area and the Sacramento Valley. Then in the early 1870s he came to South Fork Valley and began structuring one of the largest and most profitable livestock outfits in the entire area. Then, in 1876, he expanded his operation onto the Madeline Plains. He bought out 3 individuals in the vicinity of Madeline Creek. It was not for almost another 20 years, however, that the name Madeline Creek slowly evolved into Bailey Creek. John Benoist and Jesse Woodbridge were 2 newcomers to the Plains, and very probably were working with George Bailey. They each had a 160-acre homestead. Benoit at what is today known as Bailey Reservoir, and Woodbridge a couple of miles east of there at Chase Springs. Bailey bought both places for $500 apiece in July of 1876. Then he bought the original Geller lands from Tom Davidson, which included a 160-acre homestead and 320 acres of swamp and overflow land. Like Tule Marsh, the area on the flat where Madeline Creek flowed could have definitely been considered swamp and overflow lands without stretching the truth. Not only did Madeline Creek flow into it the year round, but the entire Madeline Plains drainage ran into a sink there. There were, of course, no dams or reservoirs anywhere in those years to curb the spring runoff, and several 100,000 acres of watershed drained into this low spot. Near the Madeline Creek foothills, the water often got a foot deep, and a few miles out away from the hills, water often stood 4 and 5 feet deep for weeks at a time in the spring of the year. George Bailey took the opportunity to capitalize on this physical feature that summer, the summer of 1876. As well as buying the Davidson lands, which cost him the pretty sum of $2,000, he filed on an additional 1,200 acres of new swamp and overflow lands. This gave him a sizable block of 1,680 acres of land on the Madeline Creek, plus the Benoit Woodbridge homestead back in the hills. Generally, this land was used by Bailey strictly as summer range for his hundreds of cattle. Very little haying was done on the place, and his cattle were driven back to South Fork for the winter. Bailey did continue, on a yearly basis, to improve his property, however. A house was eventually built for his cow boss to stay in right at the mouth of the Madeline Creek Canyon. Corrals and outbuildings were also put up and maintained in a state of excellent repair. He also fenced the lands, but over the next many years he used the unclaimed public lands, as did all the stockmen of the area. Thousands upon thousands of acres of public domain provided excellent high summer ranges loaded with succulent grasses, for George H. Bailey's thousands of cattle for many years. Next, we'll hear about Tule Lake's first native family, Van Loan.